If you have ever loved motorcycles, you know the name Vincent. The Black Shadow, the black V-twin with the great 5-inch speedometer that read all the way to 150, the machine older riders still speak of in a lowered voice. It was the fastest motorcycle in the world, the first true superbike, built by hand in a single Hertfordshire barn by a couple of hundred craftsmen. It outran everything on road and track. It set speed records on 2 continents. It survived the war, survived the rationing, survived shortages so severe that machines left the works with their wheel rims painted black for want of chrome. And then, after just 27 years of building the finest motorcycles on Earth, the barn fell silent, and no Vincent was ever built again. How does the maker of the greatest motorcycle in the world simply stop? What happened inside that barn? Chapter 1. The Boy Who Hated a Harsh Ride. The story does not begin on the Salt. It begins in a nursery in Fulham in the spring of 1908, with a boy who would grow up hating one very particular thing, the way a motorcycle punished the man who rode it. Philip Conrad Vincent was born on the 14th of March, 1908, in Wilbraham Gardens, and he was born English by design. His mother, Ada, had travelled all the way back from Argentina to give birth on English soil, so that her son would hold a British passport. The family were not short of money. There was a cattle ranch some 300 miles from Buenos Aires, a fortune built on grass and beef and distance, and it was that distant fortune that would one day pay for the fastest motorcycle in the world. Remember the ranch. It matters later, when it's gone. He was sent to Harrow, and it was at Harrow, of all places, that the obsession took hold. Confined to the school sanatorium for 3 weeks, laid up alongside another boy who happened to be a motorcycle enthusiast, young Philip caught something there was no cure for. He went up to Cambridge to read mechanical sciences, but by then his mind was already made up about the thing that would define the rest of his life, because Philip Vincent had decided that everyone else was wrong. In the 1920s, a motorcycle had a rigid rear end. The back wheel was bolted straight to the frame, and every ridge, every pothole, every cobble in the road went straight up the rider's spine. That was simply how it was done. Everybody accepted it. Vincent did not. He was convinced, as a teenager, before he'd built anything at all, that a sprung rear wheel would make a machine faster, safer, and kinder to ride. So in 1927, he built a prototype he called the Vincent Special, and in 1928, still only 20 years old, he patented a cantilever sprung rear suspension. It was elegant, it worked, and it would appear on every single Vincent motorcycle built from that day until the very last one, nearly 30 years later. Almost every high-performance frame on the road today carries an echo of what a Cambridge undergraduate sketched out before he'd finished his degree. To understand how strange that made him, you have to picture the British motorcycle industry he was walking into. It was a crowded, scrappy trade. Dozens of small marques with proud names, most of them building their machines around engines they'd bought in from outside firms like JP and Rudge, most of them fitting the same rigid rear ends and the same girder forks, most of them selling much the same thing to much the same men. In that field of followers, here was a young man insisting, before he'd sold a single motorcycle, on his own suspension design, his own way of doing things, his own conviction that comfort and speed were the same problem solved twice. He was difficult. He was certain. He had the particular certainty of a clever young man with money behind him and an idea he could not let go of. Every one of those qualities would build the greatest motorcycle in the world. Every one of them would help sink the company that made it. But an idea is not a company. To build motorcycles, he needed a name, and here the family money spoke. The name he bought belonged to a genuine hero. Howard Raymond Davies had won the senior TT on the Isle of Man in 1924. Before that, he'd been a fighter pilot in the Royal Flying Corps, shot down and taken prisoner, and the legend runs that he first dreamed up his own motorcycle while sitting in a German prison camp, working out how he'd have done things differently. When he came home, he founded HRD Motors, his own initials on the tank. The machines were beautiful. The business was not. By January of 1928, HRD had gone into voluntary liquidation. Ernest Humphreys, of the firm OK Supreme, bought the wreckage mainly for the factory space, then put the rest back up for sale. The name, the jigs, the tools, the drawings, the spare parts. Vincent, advised by wiser heads that a young man should start under an established name rather than an unknown one, bought the lot for £450. His father's money paid for it. The company was renamed the Vincent HRD Company, and on the tank the words "The Vincent" sat in tiny letters above a great big HRD. The son's ambition, quite literally, in the shadow of another man's initials. His family, sensibly, did not simply hand a headstrong young perfectionist a checkbook and wish him luck. A family friend and engineer named Frank Walker was installed as managing director, there, in the words of the day, to act as a steadying influence. Keep Frank Walker in mind, too. Years from now, he'll say no to the greatest motorcycle his own company would ever build and be overruled by two men working behind his back. Production moved out to Stevenage, into premises that included a barn said to date back to 1660, a Hertfordshire farmyard where one of the 20th century's great machines would take shape by hand. For the first few years, Vincent did what everyone else did. He bought his engines in from outside suppliers and built his own frames around them. And for a while that was fine, until 1934 and the Isle of Man, and a humiliation that changed everything. He entered 3 machines in the TT that year. All 3 failed to finish, and the failures weren't his. They were in the bought-in engines, other men's work letting his motorcycles down in front of the entire motorcycling world. Vincent came home from the island furious, and he made a decision that a cautious man would never have made. If he couldn't trust anyone else's engine, he would build his own. He had no engine designer capable of it. He had no proven design. He had a conviction, a barn in Stevenage, and the last of a cattle rancher's fortune. What he needed now was the right man, and the right man was already on his way from the other side of the world. Chapter 2. The Plumber's Nightmare. The greatest British superbike engine of all time was born from 2 pieces of paper lying on top of one another. In 1936, in the drawing office at Stevenage, an Australian engineer noticed 2 tracings of Vincent's single-cylinder engine sitting overlapped on his board, one slightly turned across the other, forming a rough V. Most men would have squared the papers up and thought nothing of it. This man set them out deliberately, 2 cylinders splayed into a V-twin, inside a frame that had originally been built for the record breaker Eric Fernihoe. When Vincent saw it, he didn't hesitate. He was instantly, completely enthusiastic. And a few weeks later, the first Vincent 1000 existed. The Australian was Phil Irving, and he is the other half of this story. Irving had been born in 1903 in the west of Victoria, and he had almost no formal qualifications to his name. He'd joined a firm called Crankless Engines at 18 as a draftsman, run a motorcycle dealership out in Ballarat, and then, in 1930, simply pointed himself at England and left. He'd worked at Velocet, learning the dark art of aluminium casting, how to pour molten metal into sand and have it come out strong and light and true, before joining Vincent late in 1931 alongside another engineer, E.J. Massey, who'd come across from the original HRD firm. Irving was witty, practical and self-taught to the bone, and he could do the thing that separates real engineers from clever ones. He could hold an entire running machine in his head and know, before it was built, where it would fail. He wrote a technical column in the motorcycling press under the pen name Slide Rule, teaching ordinary riders the mathematics of tuning. He would go on to write the books, Tuning for Speed among them, that a whole generation learned their craft from, and an autobiography that reads like the memoir of a man who was quietly amused by his own genius. If Vincent was the obsessive aristocratic visionary, all conviction and family fortune, Irving was the man who could actually make the vision run. The 2 of them together were far more than the sum of their parts. Apart, as the company would one day discover, at the worst possible moment, neither was quite enough. Their first collaboration had come 2 years earlier. A 500 cubic centimetre single, overhead valve, built in 1934, the Touring Meteor and the Sportier Comet. 26 brake horsepower at 5,300 revolutions per minute, and the Comet in racing trim could touch 90 miles an hour. For a single, it was quick, but it was the 2 overlapping drawings that produced the machine that made the name. The Series A Rapide arrived in October of 1936, 998 cubic centimetres, just under a litre, a V-twin with its cylinders set at 47.5 degrees, 45 brake horsepower, and a top speed of 110 miles an hour. In 1936, that made it the fastest production vehicle in the world, not the fastest motorcycle. The fastest thing you could buy and ride or drive away, faster than any car on any showroom floor. The riders who saw it gave it a nickname that stuck, the Plumber's Nightmare. because the oil didn't run inside the engine. It ran outside it, through a bewildering maze of external pipes, looping and crossing all over the machine like the underside of a Victorian sink. It looked mad. It looked like something assembled in a hurry from spare parts, and it went like nothing else on Earth. It also had a problem, and the problem was a symptom of everything that made Vincent both brilliant and doomed. The engine made so much power that it simply overwhelmed the bought-in Berman clutch and gearbox behind it. The Vincent didn't fit the world's components. The world's components couldn't cope with the Vincent. Every solution the two men reached for created a new problem further down the machine, because they refused, always, to build down to what already existed. There was a stubbornness in both of them that ran deeper than engineering. Both Phils, Vincent and Irving, flatly refused to fit telescopic front forks, even as the rest of the industry moved to them, because they were convinced that the old-fashioned girder fork was stiffer and therefore better. Sometimes that contrarian streak was genius. Sometimes it was folly. For now it hardly mattered, because they had built the fastest machine in the world and the whole of motorcycling had begun to notice. And then, in September of 1939, the world stopped building motorcycles and started building weapons. Chapter 3. No Frame. A tall war is where most small firms simply vanish. For Vincent, the war became a laboratory. Through the conflict, the Stevenage works turned to munitions, as nearly every engineering shop in Britain did. But Vincent and Irving also went to work on something stranger and more inventive, a highly efficient opposed piston two-stroke engine, developed from 1942, intended to power air-dropped lifeboats for the RAF. Picture the problem they were handed. A bomber crew ditches in the Channel or the freezing North Sea. They scramble into a dinghy, soaked, and they drift. What they need is a proper motorized boat, dropped to them by parachute, with an engine light enough to fall from the sky and reliable enough to start first time in salt water and carry exhausted men to shore. Vincent and Irving built it, drawing on Vincent's own opposed piston patents, and it was clever enough that development outlasted the war itself, though in the end it never quite entered service. Irving, for his part, had drifted back and forth to Velocet across these years, before returning to Vincent for good in 1943. That was the kind of company Vincent ran, one that never once stopped inventing, even when inventing paid nothing at all. But the real work of the war years was being done on paper, in secret, for a machine that couldn't be sold until the fighting stopped, and when it was finally revealed, it rewrote the rulebook. The Series B Rapide had been designed during the war and shown to the press even before hostilities ended, with production beginning in 1946. Everything the plumber's nightmare had got wrong, this machine got right. The oil pipes were gone, routed internally now, cleanly, out of sight. The engine and gearbox were built as a single unit, and then came the idea that made engineers all over the world stop and stare. Vincent got rid of the frame, not part of it. The frame. There was no conventional set of tubes cradling the engine, because Vincent had decided the engine itself was strong enough to be the frame. A stressed member, bolted to a compact box-section spine that ran over the top and doubled, ingeniously, as the oil tank. His logic was pure Vincent, and he put it in a single sentence that tells you everything about how the man's mind worked. What isn't there takes up no space, cannot bend, and weighs nothing. So get rid of the frame tubes altogether. Where other men added strength, Vincent subtracted weakness. And that was only the beginning of it. The Series B and the machines that followed carried a catalogue of ideas that were, quite simply, decades ahead of everyone else. The cantilever rear suspension he'd patented as a boy. A rear wheel you could detach and reverse in minutes, so a single wheel could carry two different size sprockets, one for touring, one for speed. Twin brake drums on each wheel, front and rear. 4 brakes where rivals fitted 2 because a machine this fast needed to stop as seriously as it went. Brake and gear levers you could adjust to fit your own hands. A rear mudguard hinged so you could get at the wheel. Riders in 1946 were looking at features that most manufacturers wouldn't reach for another 20 or 30 years. When the machine was shown, the trade did not quite know what to make of it. Rival engineers came to look at a motorcycle with no frame and went away shaking their heads, half in admiration, half in disbelief that it could possibly hold together. It did hold together. It held together better than the machines that had frames. That was the maddening thing about Vincent. The ideas that sounded like the fantasies of a man who'd never got his hands dirty turned out, again and again, to be right. A war-weary Britain, grey and rationed and rebuilding, was being offered a glimpse of a future that no one else in the industry had even imagined yet, designed in secret, in a barn, while the bombs were still falling. And the ambition wasn't only in the metal. Britain, ruined and in debt, had been handed a national slogan by its government: export or die. Earn foreign money, or the country would not recover. Vincent had understood this before Whitehall said it out loud. The first American dealership had already opened, set up by a man named Eugene Orcutt in Philadelphia, back in 1944, before the war was even over. The little firm in the Hertfordshire barn was already thinking in oceans. They had the engine. They had the frame that wasn't a frame. They had a foothold in America. What they didn't have yet, but were about to build, was a legend. Not merely the fastest motorcycle you could buy. The fastest, full stop. And it was about to be born against the direct orders of the man brought in to keep the company sensible. Chapter 4. The World's Fastest. Frank Walker said no. The managing director, the steadying influence, the man the family trusted to keep the firm on solid ground, looked at Philip Vincent's proposal for a hotted-up, tuned, faster version of the Rapide and refused to authorize it. It was too much, too extreme. A sensible company did not need to build the fastest motorcycle on Earth, so two men built it anyway, quietly, behind his back. Phil Irving and a young experimental tester named George Brown put together two prototypes to Vincent's specification in February of 1948, without the blessing of the man who ran the company. Brown was the sort of tester every great workshop needs: fearless, mechanically gifted, willing to take a half-finished machine out onto the road and find its edge. His own development bike, the one used to sort the fast machines, carried the nickname Gunga Din, and it was thrashed mercilessly in the service of making the production motorcycles honest. When a journalist called Charles Markham, of the magazine Motorcycling, took one of the new prototypes out and clocked 122 miles an hour, the argument was over. You do not unride 122 miles an hour. They had their machine. Later that year, it stood on the stand at the Earl's Court Show in London, black and low and unmistakable, and the public got its first proper look at the first true superbike the world had ever produced. They called it the Black Shadow. Everything about it was built to intimidate. The engine, 998 cubic centimeters of it, was finished in black, coated in a heat-resisting enamel the firm called Pelumin, so that the whole power unit sat there dark and menacing beneath the tank. 55 brake horsepower, 125 miles an hour, straight off the showroom floor, at a time when a fast car struggled past 70, and mounted, where the rider couldn't miss it, a single enormous 5-inch Smith's speedometer reading all the way round to 150 miles an hour. Most machines of the day had speedometers that were, frankly, optimistic. The Black Shadow's was a promise. The advertisements didn't bother with modesty. The world's fastest standard motorcycle, they said. This is a fact, not a slogan. It was a fact, and they were about to prove it on a lake of salt. First, though, they built something even more extreme. If the Black Shadow was the fastest thing you could buy, the Black Lightning was what you got when Vincent stopped caring about the road altogether. Every steel component that could possibly be remade in aluminium was remade in aluminium. Everything not strictly necessary to going fast was stripped away and thrown in a corner. The result weighed 380 pounds, down from the 458 pounds of a standard machine. Nearly 80 pounds of civilization simply deleted. They built barely 30 of them. Each one was a scalpel. The first Black Lightning ever built went to America, to a wealthy enthusiast and sponsor named John Edgar, and on the 13th of September 1948, it carried a man into the single most famous photograph in the history of motorcycling. His name was Rolly Free, and he was 48 years old. On the blinding white flats at Bonneville, a dead flat sea of dried salt, where the horizon shimmers and there is nothing to hit for miles, he set out to take the American motorcycle speed record on Edgar's mobile-sponsored Vincent. The heat came up off the salt in waves. The glare was the kind that closes a man's eyes to slits. On his early runs, he wore leathers, as any sane man would at those speeds, and the leathers began to tear apart in the wind at around 147 miles an hour, flapping and dragging, the sheer resistance of them holding the machine back from the record. So Rolly Free did something that no sane man would do. He stripped off. He took off the leathers, pulled on nothing but a borrowed pair of swimming trunks, a bathing cap, and a pair of borrowed plimsolls, lay flat along the whole length of the motorcycle with his legs stretched out straight behind him and his chin down over the rear mudguard, and he ran it flat out across the salt with his bare skin inches from the ground. He averaged 150 miles an hour, 150.3 to be exact, covering the measured mile in under 24 seconds. A photographer leaning out of a chase car caught him at full stretch, a near-naked man lying flat along a black motorcycle, doing 150 miles an hour across a white desert, wearing a swimsuit. It is, to this day, probably the most famous image the sport has ever produced. Rolly Free would be inducted into the Motorcycle Hall of Fame half a century later, in 1998, and the picture is the reason a stranger who has never heard the name Vincent will stop and stare. The records kept coming. Years later, in 1955, a New Zealander named Russell Wright would take the outright motorcycle land speed record for the world at over 185 miles an hour. On a Vincent. The press ran out of superlatives. One magazine, testing the machine, called it a connoisseur's motorcycle, one of the outstanding designs of all time. From a tiny barn in Stevenage, a handful of men had built the fastest motorcycle on the planet, and everyone who mattered knew it. This was the summit. Adverts screaming the world's fastest. A near-naked man on the salt flats. Records falling on 2 continents. And it is exactly here, at the very top, that the tragedy is hiding. Because the machine that conquered the world was being built by hand by 200 people in a way that could never, ever pay. Chapter 5. The Works at Stevenage. To understand why the fastest motorcycle in the world couldn't save the company that built it, you have to walk into the works. There was no assembly line at Stevenage. There was no great moving track, no army of workers each tightening one bolt as the machines rolled past. There were benches. There were men, skilled men, building motorcycles the way a cabinet maker builds furniture, by hand, one at a time, in small batches, in an old farmyard on the high street in the old town. The firm had started in 1928 with about a dozen staff. Even at its absolute peak, it employed only around 200 people, 200, to build the fastest motorcycle on earth and sell it to the world. Step through the gates on a working morning, and the first thing that reaches you is the smell. Not the acrid, overwhelming stink of a mass factory, but a layered, particular thing. Cutting oil, warm metal, the sharp tang of petrol from machines waiting to be tested, and underneath it, the peculiar dry smell of aluminium swarf curling off a lathe. There is the heat-resistant enamel they call pylomin, drying black on engine cases. There is the ordinary human smell of tea and cigarettes and men who have worked here for years, and the sound is wrong for a factory, because it isn't the deafening, rhythmic hammer of a production line. It is the sound of individual work, a file drawing across metal, the ring of a spanner, a fitter talking to the machine under his breath as he sets a valve clearance by feel, by the knowledge in his own hands, the way his father might have set a watch. And then, cutting through all of it, without warning, the enormous hard bark of a litre V-twin firing up on the test bench, a sound that rattles the old barn timbers and stops conversation dead. A Vincent did not roll off a line. It accumulated, on a bench under one man's hands, part by part, until it became a motorcycle. And when it was finished, it was not simply crated and shipped. The world's fastest claim wasn't marketing bravado dreamed up in an office. It was backed by a genuine, obsessive testing culture. The testers took the machines out onto the local Hertfordshire roads and wrung them out, because Vincent would not put his name on a speed he hadn't seen for himself. Imagine living on one of those lanes in the late 1940s and hearing it, the flat, hard thunder of a black shadow being held wide open through the bends near the works, a tester crouched over the tank chasing the last few miles an hour before he'd sign the machine off as fit to carry the name. Among those testers was a young man serving his apprenticeship at the works, whose name would later fill trophy cabinets. John Surtees, who would go on to become world champion on 2 wheels and on 4, the only man ever to win at the very top in both. He learned part of his trade here, among the benches at Stevenage, and he never forgot it. Decades later, an old man, he would still speak about this place. So did George Brown, the tester who'd helped build the first Black Shadows in secret, and who would become a drag racing legend in his own right on a fearsome Vincent special he named Nero, tearing up British sprint strips long after the factory that made his machines had closed its doors. The chief tester, Ted Davis, spent his working life proving these engines honest. The draftsman, Hans Edwards, turned Vincent's demands into lines on paper, and beneath them all were the ordinary shop floor men, fitters and machinists and painters whose names never made the magazines but whose hands are in every surviving machine. Men like Albert Ito, who remembered this place for the rest of his life. They were the 200, a small band of craftsmen in a barn, turning out the finest motorcycles in the world. But craft on this scale has a price, and the price was the whole problem. In the years after the war, Britain was rationed and broke, and even the raw materials fought back. There were shortages of steel and of the nickel-chrome alloys the machines needed. Every Vincent was assembled slowly, carefully, expensively, by hand. And so the finished machine cost what a hand-built masterpiece costs. In the numbers that survive, one figure lands harder than any other. A new Vincent cost roughly the equivalent of an average working man's wages for an entire year. A year of your life, in exchange for the fastest motorcycle in the world. In America, it sold for something like double the price of a comparable Triumph twin. This was not transport. This was the Bentley of motorcycles. The machine for the wealthy, the discerning, the obsessed. Bruce Superior had occupied that ground before the war. Vincent owned it now. And to own one was to belong to something. A Vincent rider was not a man who simply needed to get to work. He was a man who had chosen the finest, fastest thing on two wheels and paid dearly for the privilege. To ride one was an experience nothing else could match. The long, low machine gathering itself beneath you, the great V-twin pulling with a deep, unhurried violence, the speedometer needles sweeping round toward numbers no other production motorcycle could reach. Doctors bought them, racing men bought them, enthusiasts who'd saved for years bought them, and every one of those buyers was, without knowing it, part of the problem, because there were never going to be enough of them. A machine this dear, this specialized, this magnificent, could only ever speak to the few. The many had already been priced out before they walked through the showroom door, and the numbers tell you just how few could ever climb aboard. Across the entire post-war life of the company, the works turned out a total of 11,036 machines. Of those, 6,852 were the big liter twins. Of the famous Black Shadow itself, only around 1,774 were ever built. Some variants are rarer still, a mere 15 of the White Shadow found buyers, 31 of the racing Grey Flash, a bare 16 of a special export model, the Red Comet, ever shipped to the United States. These were not numbers that build a fortune. These were numbers that build a legend and empty a bank account at the same time. Here is the cruelty of it. Turn the pages of the motorcycle press at the end of the 1940s, and every Vincent advert is shouting the same thing: the world's fastest. A fact, not a slogan. Out on the Salt at Bonneville, Rolly Free's photograph is being printed and reprinted around the globe. The name has never stood higher. The reputation is untouchable, and behind the benches, quietly, out of sight of all of it, the money is already gone. Because a company that builds 200 machines by hand, at the cost of a year's wages each, into a country too poor to buy them, and a world that has other ideas. That company is not a business. It is a beautiful, doomed act of devotion. The reputation was a mountain, the balance sheet was a cliff, and at the exact moment the world decided the Vincent was the finest motorcycle it had ever seen, the firm that made it was sliding, silently, toward a receiver's office and a winding-up notice. There is a particular kind of tragedy in that gap, not the tragedy of a bad product, or a foolish owner, or a firm that lost its way. The machines were perfect. The men were brilliant. The fame was entirely deserved. And none of it, not the records, not the photograph on the Salt, not the connoisseur's praise in the press, none of it could close the distance between what a Vincent cost to build and what anyone could be persuaded to pay. The better they made the motorcycle, the more it cost. The more it cost, the fewer they sold. The fewer they sold, the deeper the hole. Excellence itself was the trap. They had built the fastest motorcycle on earth. They had never once worked out how to build it for less than it cost. And that, not one plastic panel, not one strange decision still 6 years away, is the flaw that would kill them. Speed, it turned out, was expensive. Chapter 6. The Cracks Beneath. Here is a date that ought to be impossible. The 28th of October, 1949. That autumn, a winding-up petition was filed against the Vincent HRD company, and a receiver named C.E. Bailey was appointed to take charge of its affairs. Read that back slowly. Barely a year after Rollie Free lay flat on the salt at Bonneville and made the Vincent name immortal, while the advertisements still screamed the world's fastest from the pages of the motorcycle press, the company that built it was insolvent. The most admired motorcycle manufacturer on earth could not pay its bills. The reputation and the reality had never once been in the same room together, and now the reality had walked in. To understand how a firm this celebrated could arrive at a winding-up petition, you have to accept an uncomfortable truth about it. The Vincent HRD company had almost never made real money. Even in the good years, even at the height of the fame, the profits were tiny, the thin margins of a workshop that built masterpieces slowly and sold them in handfuls. There was no fat on the business, no reserve, no cushion to fall back on when a bad year came, because every year had been, in the accountant's cold reckoning, a near thing. A firm like that does not need a catastrophe to fail. It only needs the ordinary bad luck of trading to arrive all at once, and in the years around 1949, it did. It wasn't one disaster that did it. It was the slow arithmetic that had been running underneath the whole glorious enterprise from the start. But in the years around that first receivership, 3 separate blows landed on a firm that could not absorb even one of them. The first came from the ground up, from the raw materials themselves. Post-war Britain was rationed and rebuilding, and when the Korean War broke out at the start of the 50s, the government regulated the nickel-chrome steels that a machine like the Vincent depended on. There are stories from these years of motorcycles leaving the works with their wheel rims painted black, not for style, but because the proper plating materials simply could not be had. The finest motorcycle in the world going out of the door with painted rims because the country had run short of chrome. That is the texture of the age. The second blow came from America, from the deal that was meant to save everything. The great hope of the export drive was an alliance with the Indian Motorcycle Company, the legendary American marque, whose president, Ralph Rogers, had taken Vincent on as a United States distributor. The plan was audacious. Send an Indian chassis to Stevenage, drop a Vincent V-twin into it, and build a machine they called the Vindian. Indian's name and reach, Vincent's engine and genius, sold across the vast American market. Vincent, it said, offered to supply 50 engines a week. 50 a week, for a firm that struggled to build a fraction of that, and then it collapsed. In September of 1949, the pound was devalued, and overnight the economics of shipping British engines to America shifted beneath their feet. A financier named John Brockhouse, who held the purse strings on the American side, pulled his funding until Vincent could prove the company was financially solid, which was the one thing on earth Vincent could not do. The deal died. The great American rescue that was going to carry the firm to safety simply evaporated, and the capital lost. Chasing it helped push the company, a few years later, into being reconstituted under a new name, Vincent Engineers, Stevenage, Limited. Think about what that deal had represented. 50 engines a week, flowing across the Atlantic into the biggest motorcycle market on earth, under the badge of an American legend. It was the one plan that might have given the firm the volume it desperately needed, the scale that could finally have made the arithmetic work, and it was taken away not by any failure of the machine, which was magnificent, but by a movement in the exchange rate and a nervous financier's caution. The Vincent didn't lose America because it wasn't good enough. It lost America because it wasn't solvent enough, and so the single door marked survival swung shut. The third blow was the quietest and the worst. In 1949, as the receiver moved in, Phil Irving went home. The Australian who had turned 2 overlapping drawings into the greatest engine in British motorcycling, who could hold a whole machine in his head, who was half the creative heart of the entire enterprise, he left, essentially on the next boat, back to Australia. The timing could not have been crueler. At the precise moment the company most needed genius, half of its genius walked out of the door and sailed away. He would keep faith with the marque from afar, serving the owners' club for decades to come. But he was gone from the drawing office, and the drawing office was never the same. From here on, Vincent would face the hardest years of his life without the one man who had always been able to turn his impossible ideas into running metal. And Philip Vincent himself was no longer whole. In the winter of 1948, though some accounts place it a year earlier, Vincent had been out testing a rapide on a windswept airfield near the factory at around 80 miles an hour, wearing no helmet. There was an accident. It left him, by the account of those closest to him, in a coma for months, and the true extent of his injuries was kept quiet for years afterwards. The driving force of the whole company, the man whose conviction was the only reason any of it existed, had been physically broken at the very moment the firm needed him at his strongest. This is one of the least told turning points in the whole story, and one of the most important. A company like Vincent's was not really a company at all in the ordinary sense. It was one man's vision, made in metal by the people who believed in him. Take that man off the board for months, leave him diminished for years, and you have not merely lost an executive, you have cut the head off the thing. The confidence, the certainty, the sheer, bloody-minded conviction that had built the fastest motorcycle in the world against every sensible objection, all of it had to keep running the firm through a body and a mind that would never be quite whole again. He would carry on, but the man who came back was not quite the man who had gone out on that airfield. And here is the detail that tells you everything about the men who ran this place. Through all of it, production never stopped. Receiver appointed, company insolvent, the whole enterprise legally in the hands of a man sent to wind it up, and still, in the barn at Stevenage, the benches kept turning out motorcycles. They did not down tools and wait for the end. They built, because building was the only thing they knew how to do, and because the machines were, even now, the finest in the world. There is something almost unbearably British about it, carrying on, quietly, making the best motorcycle on earth, while the receiver goes through the books in the office next door. Around all of this, the ground itself was shifting. The British motorcycle buyer was changing his mind about what a motorcycle was for. Before the war, a big machine had been an object of aspiration, the thing a young man dreamed of and saved for. Now the aspiration was moving on to something with 4 wheels and a roof. The cheap, small commuter bike was rising, the little 250 that got a working man to the factory and back for pennies, and behind it, more dangerous still, came the small, cheap car, the thing that would eventually empty the roads of working men on 2 wheels altogether. A man could now sit dry, with his wife beside him and his children in the back, for not a great deal more than the price of a serious motorcycle. Set against that, no amount of speed or beauty could hold the ground. The great, expensive, hand-built V-twin was becoming a beautiful anachronism, a masterpiece the market no longer had a use for. It had been designed for a world of open roads and mechanical romance, and that world was closing down, showroom by showroom, as fast as the new small cars could fill the streets. The Vincent was not being beaten by a better motorcycle. There was no better motorcycle. It was being quietly abandoned by a country that had decided it wanted something else entirely. The world that had made the Vincent possible was ending, not with a crash, but with a shrug. A weaker man would have stopped there. Philip Vincent was not a weaker man, and what he did next is the part of this story that everyone thinks they know. Chapter 7. The Gentleman's Express. By the middle of the 1950s, the board of the company had given Philip Vincent what one historian has called, in effect, one last chance. One more idea. One more roll of the dice. Understand the position they were in. The receivership, the lost American deal, the departed genius, the injured founder, the market walking away, all of it had brought the firm to a point where there was money and patience for perhaps one final throw. Whatever Vincent proposed next would have to be the thing that turned it round, or there would be nothing left to propose. Most men, handed a company in that state, would have played it safe. A cheaper model, a simpler machine, something to move volume and steady the ship. Vincent did the opposite. Given one last chance to save the firm, he reached not for caution, but for his most radical, most personal, most divisive idea. He reached for the thing he was certain the world would come to see his way. He had been certain before, about the suspension, about the frameless engine, about the whole impossible enterprise, and he had been right every single time. He had no reason left to doubt himself, and every reason in the world to. He had been thinking about it for years. Vincent looked at his magnificent machine, with its glorious V-twin engine hanging out in the open air, and he saw a problem that no one else considered a problem at all. He saw the rain. He saw the road grime. He saw a well-dressed man in a good suit, the kind of prosperous customer the firm needed, arriving at his destination spattered in oil and soaked through, and deciding, reasonably enough, to buy a car instead. And Vincent decided he could solve it. And you have to grant him this. The logic was not stupid. The car was the enemy now. The car kept a man dry, kept him clean, kept his dignity intact on the way to the office. If the motorcycle was going to compete for the wallet of a serious, prosperous adult, perhaps it needed to offer some of the same civilization. Vincent, ever the engineer, looked at the problem the way he looked at every problem, as something that could be solved with cleverness and conviction. The trouble was that this particular problem was not an engineering problem at all. It was a problem of the human heart, of what a man wants a motorcycle to be. And on that, for the first time in his career, Philip Vincent's certainty led him badly astray. His answer was to take the most beautiful engine in motorcycling and cover it up. The idea was total enclosure, great sweeping panels of fiberglass wrapped around the machine, over the engine, over the gearbox, shielding the rider from the weather and the mess. Vincent called it a two-wheeled Bentley, a gentleman's express on which a man could commute to the office in his business suit, not in leathers and nasty old waxed cotton. He believed sincerely that this was his finest work, the logical destination of everything he'd ever thought about motorcycling. Weather protection, dignity, engineering, all in one. The models were called the Black Knight and the Black Prince, and they were unveiled with great ceremony at the Earl's Court Show in November of 1954, the same great London hall where, 6 years earlier, the naked Black Shadow had stopped the crowds dead. The response split the room clean in two. It was, as one description has it, the motorcycle you either loved or hated, and most of Vincent's own customers hated it. This is the part of the story everyone remembers, the one mistake, the plastic that killed the greatest motorcycle in the world, and it is exactly here that the legend and the truth go their separate ways, because most of what is said about those fiberglass panels is wrong. Start with the myth that will not die, that enclosing the engine caused it to overheat and seize. It did not. The opposite is documented. The enclosure, far from choking the engine, actually channeled more cooling air onto the rear cylinder, the very cylinder that ran hottest, the one that had always struggled for air on the naked machine. This is not a modern apology invented to rescue Vincent's reputation. It is the testimony of people who have owned and ridden these machines, among them collectors who know the mark intimately, and it squares exactly with what the period press found. When a leading magazine of the day road-tested the enclosed Black Prince, it did not report a machine cooking itself to death. It found the very opposite, a motorcycle that handled every bit as well as the naked Black Shadow, with improved fuel consumption into the bargain. The panels costed a few miles an hour off the very top end, 5, perhaps 10, which mattered not at all on a machine built for the comfortable, weatherproof mile rather than the salt flat. The engines did not seize because they were enclosed. Let that be said plainly, because it has been said wrongly for 70 years. The image is too good to give up. The beautiful engine smothered under plastic, choking to death on its own ambition, a perfect little parable of hubris. It is a wonderful story. It is simply not what happened. The bodywork worked. The cooling worked. The machine underneath was as magnificent as it had ever been. So if the panels didn't wreck the machine, what did they do? They failed at something more human than engineering. They failed as an object of desire. The British motorcyclist of 1954 did not want his engine hidden. The exposed V-twin, all that glorious mechanical honesty, was the entire point. It was what he had paid a year's wages for, what he wanted the world to see. Vincent had given him a masterpiece and then wrapped it in a bathtub. Riders looked at the Black Knight and saw, unkindly, a big Lambretta. And the market's verdict was brutal and unmistakable. More than half of all Series D machines left the factory with no enclosure at all. The buyers wanted the naked engine so badly that the firm ended up building open versions simply to shift them. Of the machines that were fully enclosed, the thing Vincent believed was his masterpiece, only a couple of hundred or so, by the best surviving count, ever left Stevenage before the end. Read that number against his ambition, and it is almost unbearable. The idea he was certain would save the company was rejected outright by the very people who loved his motorcycles most. and the enclosure hurt the company in a way that had nothing to do with taste. The fiberglass itself was a problem. This was new material in 1954, and the quality of the early panels was poor. Vincent, a perfectionist to the last, incapable of letting a substandard finish carry his name, rejected them and forced a change of supplier. That change cost roughly 4 months. 4 months of delay, for a firm bleeding cash by the week, with the first production machines slipping from late 1954 into the spring of 55. Picture it, a company with almost nothing left in the bank, its future staked on one last model, and that model stuck in limbo for a third of a year over the finish on a plastic panel. Unsold, half-finished, controversial motorcycles sitting in a factory that could no longer afford to wait for anything. The enclosure was not the fatal wound. The company was already dying when Vincent drew it. But it was a genuine misjudgment. A man so certain of his own vision that he mistook what he wanted for what the world wanted, and spent money the firm did not have, finding out he was wrong. And there is a small telling coda to it. Many of the riders who did buy the enclosed machines took them home and removed the panels. They wanted the Vincent underneath, the engine, the mechanical honesty, the thing Vincent had spent good money hiding. They unbolted his masterpiece and threw it in the shed, and rode the naked machine that had been there all along. It is hard to imagine a gentler, more devastating verdict on a man's last great idea than that. His customers liked his motorcycle so much that the first thing they did was undo his final contribution to it. The tragedy of the fiberglass is not that it seized the engines. It never did. It is that a broken man, given one last chance to save the thing he loved, spent it on the one idea his own faithful did not want, and then watched them peel it off. Chapter 8. Every other door, and the enclosure was only the most visible of the gambles. In its final years, the company Vincent had built to make the finest motorcycles in the world went looking, almost frantically, for anything else it could make instead. There was the Firefly, a tiny clip-on engine, a mere 45 cubic centimeters, that bolted onto an ordinary bicycle to give a working man cheap, powered transport. It was about as far from a Black Lightning as it is possible to travel, and still call the result a Vincent. There was the deal with the German firm NSU, and the numbers it produced tell the whole story of how far the ground had shifted. Vincent took on distribution of the little NSU, quickly moped, and assembled anglicised versions of NSU's small machines under its own roof, fitting British carburettors and British tyres and a British saddle to German engineering, and selling it under a name that had once meant the fastest thing on 2 wheels. In its first year, 1954, Vincent sold something like 20,000 of those German mopeds. 20,000. Against a bare 160 of the Vincent-badged Foxes, and 40 of another small model. Read those figures side by side and you can watch the market walking away in real time. 20,000 cheap mopeds flying out of the door, while the machines that carried Vincent's own soul sold in tens. The public had made its choice, and it wasn't the masterpiece. And consider what that meant for the men in the works. This was a firm whose whole identity was built on being the best, on the exposed V-twin, on the salt flat record, on the 2 words, world's fastest, that were a fact and not a slogan. Now its bread and butter was importing somebody else's mopeds. The pride that had built the Black Shadow had nowhere to go. You cannot pour a lifetime's craftsmanship into fitting a British saddle to a German commuter bike. The soul of the place was being asked to survive on work that had no soul in it, and everyone on that shop floor knew the difference. And then the ideas grew stranger. There was a 3-wheeler prototype, a small enclosed machine, later given the name Polyphemus, after the one-eyed giant of Greek myth. There was the Picador, a Vincent Fate twin, that thoroughbred engine born to run flat out across salt flats, adapted instead to power an aerial target drone for the military, a contract the firm bid for and did not win. There was a lawnmower engine, called the Rapier, the mighty Vincent name now attached to the cutting of suburban grass. And there was the Amanda, a water scooter that may well have been one of the first personal watercraft ever built anywhere in the world. A genuinely visionary machine, decades ahead of its time, and one that carried a terrible human cost, because a Vincent engineer drowned while testing it at sea. Sit with that catalogue for a moment, and the desperation of it comes through. Mopeds from Germany, a 3-wheeler, a drone engine, a lawnmower, a water scooter that killed the man testing it. This was a firm that had built the fastest motorcycle on Earth, reaching in every direction at once, trying anything that might keep the lights on. One historian, looking back on this scattergun of half-finished ventures, put his finger on the real heartbreak of it. Had all that ingenuity, and there was so much of it, been poured back into the core motorcycle business instead of flung across a dozen desperate side projects, it might just have saved the company. The talent never left Stevenage. It was simply spent on the wrong things by men frightened of running out of time. But that would have meant one thing Philip Vincent would not do. It would have meant building the motorcycle cheaper, making it simpler, lowering the standard. And on that, the man was immovable. He staunchly refused to allow any reduction in the quality of a Vincent, right to the very end. This was the fatal virtue. The flaw and the glory folded into the same refusal. Every rival that survived the 50s survived by compromising. They built to a price. They cut where the customer wouldn't notice. They chased volume and accepted good enough, because good enough sold in the tens of thousands and kept the wages paid. Vincent could not make himself do it. To him, a motorcycle with the corners cut was not a cheaper Vincent. It was not a Vincent at all. The name meant the best, or it meant nothing. And so, offered the one road that might have led to survival, he stood in the middle of it and would not take a step. It was the most principled position imaginable. It was also, by now, a death sentence. The thing that made a Vincent was the very same thing the company could no longer afford to build. The cash was almost gone, and the man at the center of it all was about to do the hardest thing he would ever do. Chapter 9. The Last. In the summer of 1955, the Vincent Owners Club held its dinner. These were the faithful, the people who loved these machines more than anyone alive, the men who had saved for years, who rode them and cherished them and understood exactly what they were. Philip Vincent stood up in front of them, and he told them it was over. He announced that the company could no longer continue in the face of heavy losses, and that the building of motorcycles would cease almost immediately. He said it to the very people who loved his machines most, at their own dinner, in their own company. There is no crueler room in which to deliver that sentence. Imagine being in that room, the plates cleared, the speeches expected, and instead the man himself on his feet, telling you that the thing you had gathered to celebrate was ending, that there would be no more. The board had already decided the firm's future, such as it was, lay in more profitable lines. Only around 100 more of the great V-twins, the last of the Series D Rapides, would be finished. The accountants had done the sum that Vincent had spent his whole life refusing to do, and it was merciless. The company was losing money on every single machine it sold. Every one. Sold at a loss. Not the enclosed ones. Not the failures. Every machine. The naked Black Shadows, too. The whole model, from the very beginning, had been an act of love the numbers never once supported. When word got out, the knowledgeable rushed to place their orders. They knew what was ending. They wanted to own one before the door shut for good. And so, through the autumn of 1955, the men at the benches at Stevenage did the strangest work of their lives. They built the last motorcycles the firm would ever make, knowing as they built them that there would be no more. Every machine finished was one closer to the end of everything they'd given their working lives to. And then, on a Friday in December, the 16th of December, 1955, 1 week before Christmas, the last motorcycle came down off the bench at Stevenage. They labelled it, simply, the last, not the last for now, not the last of this model, the last. The men who built it knew exactly what those two words meant. That was it, the fastest motorcycle in the world, the first true superbike, the machine that had beaten everything, on the road and on the salt. Built by hand, one at a time, in a Hertfordshire barn, by 200 people who knew exactly what they were making. Finished. 1 week before Christmas. Think of the men on the floor that Friday. Some of them had been here since the start, in the barn with the 1660 timbers. They had built the Plumber's Nightmare and the Series B and the Black Shadow. They had ridden the specials down the Hertfordshire lanes to sign them off. They had made, with their own hands, the finest motorcycles the world had ever seen. And now they set down their tools on the last one, and there was nothing more to build. There were no bailiffs at the gate, no dramatic scenes, just a proud man standing in front of the people who loved his work, quietly conceding that excellence and arithmetic could not, in the end, be reconciled. He had promised, always, that spares would remain available to owners, a promise that has been kept in large part, to this very day. Even in surrender, the standard held. But the motorcycles were finished, and Stevenage fell quiet. 27 years after a boy who hated a harsh ride built his first sprung frame, the barn stopped building motorcycles for good. Chapter 10. Ruins and Resurrection. The company itself limped on for a few years in other trades: industrial engines, the water scooter, the target drone work. It was not enough. In 1959, the firm went into receivership for the second time, and this time there was no coming back. The name, the assets, and the rights to the components were bought up by Harper Engines of Stevenage, and in 1960, Philip Vincent walked out of the Stevenage works for the last time. The rest of his life reads like a long, quiet dimming. He worked as a car dealer. He wrote. He poured most of the money he had left into a dream of a pistonless rotary engine that never came to anything, and he collaborated with the writer Roy Harper on books, including his own autobiography. He suffered strokes and heart trouble. And on the 27th of March, 1979, Philip Conrad Vincent died at Ashford, aged 71. The man who built the fastest motorcycle in the world died having exhausted a cattle fortune and never, in all those years, having made any real money from the machines that made him immortal. That distant ranch in Argentina, 300 miles from Buenos Aires. In the end, it had all gone into the barn at Stevenage. Phil Irving, the other Phil, had a very different second act. Back in Australia, the self-taught genius, who never held a formal engineering qualification, went on to design the Repco Brabham V8 engine that won the Formula One World Championship in 1966. He was appointed MBE. He served the Vincent Owners Club for decades. He died in 1992, honoured and celebrated, the draftsman who arranged 2 drawings into a legend and then went home and conquered a second sport entirely. And the works? Walk down the high street in Stevenage Old Town today, and the building is still there. But it is not a factory. The place where the world's fastest motorcycle was built by hand is now part of a school, the Thomas Allen Academy, an institution whose roots run back to 1558. Children pass through it every day. Most of them have no idea. There is a plaque. There is a motorcycle shop that still trades nearby, and that is all that marks the spot where 200 craftsmen once turned out the finest machines on earth. No monument, a plaque, and a school bell where the test engines used to bark. But here is the strange twist in the tale, the resurrection that Vincent never lived to see. The machines the world had turned its back on became the most coveted British motorcycles ever made. In January of 2018, at a Bonhams auction in Las Vegas, a 1951 Black Lightning, one of that tiny handful with a documented racing history, sold for $929,000, over £650,000. It became at that moment the most expensive motorcycle ever sold at auction, anywhere in the world, passing even the record set by a machine once owned by Steve McQueen. Rolly Free's actual record-breaking machine, the bathing suit bike itself, is said to have changed hands privately for something in the region of $1 million. An ordinary Black Shadow, if such a thing can be called ordinary, now regularly sells for more than $100,000. There is a bitter mathematics in that. The company died because it could not persuade enough people to pay what a Vincent cost to build. Now a single one fetches more than the entire firm sometimes turned over in a year. The market that killed Philip Vincent has spent the decades since bidding his ghost into the stratosphere. The reverence never faded. A Swiss engineer, Fritz Egli, built a stiffer frame around the Vincent engine and won a national championship with it. A Frenchman, Patrick Godet, later built hundreds of Egli Vincents by hand, keeping the flame alive across the decades. The folk singer Richard Thompson wrote a song, 1952, Vincent Black Lightning, that became one of the most beloved things he ever recorded, a whole romance built around the machine and its myth. The writer Hunter S. Thompson climbed aboard a Black Shadow and reported, in his own unmistakable way, that ridden flat out for any length of time, it would almost certainly kill you. Which was, of course, exactly why people loved it. And the machines pass now through the hands of collectors and famous enthusiasts who pay fortunes to own a piece of what that barn produced. Everything Philip Vincent believed about his motorcycles turned out to be true. The world just took 50 years and his entire fortune to agree with him. Chapter 11. What remains? So what do we make of it, in the end? Not the story the title promised. Not one fatal mistake. Not a single plastic panel that toppled an empire in a year. That version is neat, and it is false. The truth is slower and sadder, and far more human. The fiberglass was a misjudgment, yes. A proud man mistaking his own taste for the world's at the worst possible moment. But the company was already dying long before he drew it, and it was dying of the very thing that made it great. Philip Vincent built the fastest, finest motorcycle in the world, and he refused, to his last breath, to build it any cheaper. That refusal was magnificent. That refusal was the whole point, and that refusal is exactly what made the company impossible to save. The better the machine, the more it cost. The more it cost, the fewer he sold. There was no version of the Vincent that was both worthy of the name and able to survive. The excellence and the extinction were the same thing, wearing two faces. Stand outside that school on the Stevenage High Street now, and there is nothing to hear. No file drawing across metal, no spanner ringing on the bench, no sudden, timber-rattling bark of a litre V-twin firing up to be tested and signed off and sent out into the world. The men are gone. The benches are gone. The barn is a classroom. And somewhere in a heated garage on the far side of the world, a collector polishes a black V-twin worth more than a house, a machine built at a loss, by hand, by people who knew they'd never grow rich making it, because making it well was the only way they knew how. Philip Vincent got everything right except the arithmetic. He built a legend and it cost him everything he had. Speed, in the end, was expensive. It always had been, and the men at Stevenage paid the full price of it, gladly, to the very last machine.